This is the foundation stone of the first purpose-built synagogue in Johannesburg, 1888. This is the story of the South African Jewish community, a small and disparate group that somehow managed to establish itself in a hostile environment at the foot of Africa, grow, prosper, and integrate itself into the mixed fortunes of a developing nation. Remarkably, even though it never amounted to much more than a tiny percentage of the general population, its contribution to the making of the nation and its tally of significant individuals and noteworthy achievements was way out of proportion to its actual numbers. Now, all of this may sound as if the community no longer exists or has moved on, one more group amongst many wandering Jews. That's not the case. And the community remains a vibrant part of the proudly proclaimed New South Africa, even though its numbers aren't as many as they once were. And here I am, one of their number, a second-generation Jewish South African, or South African Jew, as the old argument has it, born and bred in Johannesburg, though none of this was here when I was born. My father and mother came from Germiston and Kimberley, respectively, and before them, their parents came from that area of Eastern Europe that went under the curious title of the Pale of Settlement, the only zone within the entire Russian Empire where Jews were allowed to live. How did they get here? Why did they come? That story is one of many that comprise the collective account of this community. The first documented, self-acknowledged Jew to land in Table Bay was one Siegfried Frankel, a ship's surgeon aboard a British vessel who sought a place in the newly sanctioned settlement of the British-ruled Cape. The date was 1807, and the British had been in control for a single year. Prior to that, the nascent colony had been under the rule of the Batavian Republic, and before that, had been in the charge of the monolithic Dutch East India Company. Frankel was followed by a number of individual immigrant Jews over the next 2 decades. To understand their motives and what they were seeking, we need to return to the Europe and Britain of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By the time you reached the end of the 19th century, some of the immigrants had become real characters. Amongst their number were the adventurer Jews, hoping to strike it rich, and none more significant than Barney Bonato, the Cockney barrow boy and boxing instructor. From chancer and shyster to master imperialist Cecil John Rhodes's partner, the arc of Bonato's life makes him one of the more remarkable members of the South African Jewish community. And Kimberley was established as one of the more important Jewish centers in South Africa. But of Barney and Kimberley, we'll get back to in a later episode. The Anglo-German immigrants were a distinctive community within what would become the community of South African Jews as a whole. And the next significant phase of the Jewish immigrant arrivals came about for 2 reasons and from a completely different source. The vast majority of Jews lived in the small villages and towns known as shtetls. You may recognize them from the evocation created in Fiddle on the Roof, that elegiac celebration of shtetl life.
My late grandmother, Bela Rosenstein of blessed memory, lived with us in our home for a number of years when I was in high school. When I would come home in the afternoons, I would go and sit with Boba Bela, as we called her, and she would tell us stories about life in the shtetl and her life in Lithuania. It was a beautiful place, and they certainly had a very rich culture. There was always learning. There were people coming together in the morning, in the evening. The Jews were, in a sense, in a cocoon. They were surrounded by people that were predominantly peasants. They were living amongst farmers. They were living amongst people that were predominantly illiterate. And yet they managed to carve out a life where there was this great development of the mind and soul in places of great simplicity. Unfortunately, as a result of the poverty that affected many people, as a result of the pogroms that took place across the Pale of Settlement, the political changes that were going on all around him all the time, with borders changing, and at random there would be attacks against the Jewish community, and that made them look for greener pastures.
This was not an easy decision to make. For a start, a passport was exceedingly expensive, yet another of the many taxes imposed by the Tsar's government. Now, then there was the cost of shipping. Even traveling steerage aboard an ocean liner was beyond the reach of many of these impoverished Jews. How would they sustain themselves on board? What about kosher food? In many cases, the family initially decided on a single representative who would go, establish themselves in the foreign land, find employment, and eventually, when they'd scraped together enough in savings, would send for the rest of the family. And then there was the matter of names perceived by officials at both ends of the voyage. My great-uncle, Max Sverdlov, arrived at the docks in Cape Town, no doubt bewildered and excited by his new surroundings. And in the noise and confusion of disembarkation, he was asked by the duty clerk for his name. "Max," said my great-uncle. "And your first name?" "I told you, Max." Down he went in the book as Max. And that side of the family has had the surname of Max ever since. Both the United States and South Africa initially had open-door policies, which is why they were favored destinations. But this doesn't mean that these immigrants, fleeing persecution, hardship, and for many of them, hard-scrabble poverty, were welcomed with open arms. They were seen as low class, uncivilized, grobniks, to use the Yiddish word, and despite that, Lithuania was home to some of the most learned of sages, rabbis, and ordinary folk, unlettered. This is my great-grandmother's passport that allowed her to travel with 2 of her 3 daughters to South Africa. Here on the first page, there's a line for the signature of the bearer, and stamped across it is the Russian word for unlettered. Below that, written in by hand in English, is can't write. My great-grandmother could read and write all right, but not in Russian. Yiddish was the language in which she was literate, but that was not recognized, neither by the Russian authorities, the British ones, and particularly the South Africans. And thousands of the Litvaks arriving on these shores were condemned as illiterate, demoting them even further in social standing. And with this passport, her journey, like so many other Jews from various shtetls across Europe, began aboard a steamer from Bremen, and thence to the UK. And so does our story begin.